This is a homily for the 28th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The first reading is from the second book of Kings, chapter 5, verses 14 to 17. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 17, verses 11 to 19. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. The travel narrative continues. We are again reminded in today's Gospel that Jesus and his disciples are on the way to Jerusalem, the city where Jesus is to achieve salvation for all humanity. As I've pointed out before, our Sunday lectionary devotes 19 weeks to this travel narrative, to what Jesus does and says during the pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover. Luke tells us that today's Gospel is set along the border between Samaria and Galilee. Samaria was originally the name of a city, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, but it later came to refer to the region between Galilee and Judea. The region of Samaria is located at the centre of the map that you can see here. Let me again remind you that the Sunday lectionary chooses a first reading that in some way or another complements the theme of the Gospel. Today's Gospel is the story of Jesus healing 10 lepers. And so that is complemented by a story from the second book of Kings about the healing of a leper named Naaman. We have only a few verses of the story in the first reading today, so I suggest that you go to chapter 5 of the second book of Kings and read the story in its entirety. Let's now reflect upon these two stories, both of which are about the healing of a leper. The Greek word for leper in the Gospels is lepros. This word referred to a person who is visibly afflicted with a chronic skin condition broadly called leprosy in English translations. The word used for Naaman's condition in the Hebrew Scriptures is zarat. The medical name for leprosy is Hansen's disease. However, Hansen's disease was not known in biblical times, and the description given in the Bible is not consistent with it. Zarat was for the most part curable, and it referred to various types of skin infections in human beings. Zarat in fabrics and buildings refers to types of mildew. Since, therefore, zarat afflicts not only humans but also fabrics and building materials, it cannot be identified with a single pathology. The distinctive symptom of zarat in humans is scale-like eruptions of the skin. The book of Leviticus devotes 2 chapters, chapters 13 and 14, 116 verses, to the diagnosis and cleansing of zarat. It is the priest who diagnoses the condition and declares a person unclean or clean. You'll notice in today's Gospel that Jesus tells the lepers to go and show themselves to the priests. They alone could certify their cure and give them a clean bill of health. Notice also that the lepers that Jesus encounters are standing some way off, and they call to him. Leviticus chapter 13, verses 45 to 46 says, "Anyone with zarat will wear torn clothing and disordered hair, and will cover the upper lip and shout, 'Unclean, unclean!' As long as the disease lasts, such a person will be unclean, and being unclean, will live alone and live outside the camp." So this condition is profoundly bound up with exclusion. Their physical healing enables them to return to their families and to the community to which they belonged. Robert Alter's translation of the Hebrew Scriptures translates Zararat as skin blanch. In an explanatory note, Alter tells us that the Hebrew word Zararat is traditionally translated as leprosy, but the leading symptom mentioned in this narrative and elsewhere is a complete loss of pigmentation, whereas leprosy involves lesions and lumps in the skin and sometimes a slightly paler colour, but not the whiteness of which the biblical texts speak. So what we have in today's readings is a disfiguring skin disease that remains unidentified. Let's now turn to today's first reading. Who's who in this story? Firstly, we have Elisha, a prophet in the northern kingdom of Israel. We then have Naaman, the commander of the army of the king of Aram. We then have the kings of Aram and Israel, neither of whom is named. This makes it impossible to attribute the story to a particular period in the life of Elisha. Where is the story set? We have the northern kingdom of Israel, the capital of which is Samaria. Then we have the kingdom of Aram Damascus, the capital of which is Damascus. Aram is more or less the country that today we know as Syria. So Naaman is not an Israelite. And the story is set during the lifetime of Elisha, who lived in the 9th century BC. So, Nathan is the commander of the army of the king of Aram and high in the king's favour. He is afflicted with Zararat. Naaman's wife had an Israelite slave girl, no doubt captured during one of Naaman's raids into Israel. This young slave girl tells Naaman's wife that there is a prophet in Samaria who could cure her master. The prophet that she's referring to is, of course, Elisha. Naaman's wife tells her husband what the slave girl has said, and Naaman mentions it to his king, hoping that the king can use his influence to get the prophet to come and heal him. So, when the king of Aram hears about a possible cure for his army commander, he decides to intervene on his behalf at the highest diplomatic level, king to king. He makes contact with the king of Israel, but his communique makes no mention of the prophet. When the king of Israel receives the communique, he isn't at all happy. He thinks that the king of Aram is asking him personally to heal Naaman. So we're told he tears his clothes, a traditional gesture of despair and anguish. He thinks he's being set up. He suspects that the king of Aram is asking him to do something that he knows is well beyond his powers. The king of Israel is in a state of panic and says, "Am I a god to give death and life? For him to send a man to me and ask me to cure him of his leprosy?" The king of Israel is convinced that the king of Aram is going to use his inability to heal Naaman as a pretext to attack him. But the prophet Elisha says to the king, "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come to me, and he will find there is a prophet in Israel." When Naaman gets the news that the prophet of Israel will heal him, he hurries off to Elisha's house. But Elisha isn't there. Instead, Elisha has left some instructions for Naaman with a messenger. The messenger tells him to go and bathe 7 times in the river Jordan, and his flesh will become clean once more. Now you'd think that would be good news for Naaman, but he doesn't take it that way. He's furious. Here was I, thinking he would be sure to come out to me and stand there and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the spot and cure the part that was diseased. Surely the rivers of Damascus are better than any water in Israel. Could I not bathe in them and become clean? So Naaman is doubly resentful. Firstly, that the prophet didn't turn up in person and heal him. I am an important person after all. And he's also resentful because he's been told to bathe 7 times, not in one of the beautiful rivers of Syria, but in what he considers to be a mud hole. However, his servants prevail upon him to get off his high horse and to do what the prophet said. If the prophet had asked you to do something difficult, would you not have done it? All the more reason then when he says to you, bathe and you will become clean. So Naaman swallows his pride and bathes in the river Jordan 7 times, as the prophet had instructed him to do. And he is healed of his leprosy. In the words of William Bausch, that Naaman, this great and noble and mighty general, had to let go and get down from his high horse and try a way that fundamentally was humiliating for him. And he protested that. It was like struggling with the first step of AA. He protested that there was a power greater than himself. He knew he couldn't control his leprosy. He, the general, just had to surrender. Surrender to something that he never thought he'd surrender to. The power of God in the message of a lowly prophet. You may recall that Jesus reminded the people of Nazareth of this story when he returned to his hometown. In the prophet Elisha's time, there were many lepers in Israel, but none of these was cured except the Syrian, Naaman. That so enraged the people of Nazareth that they sprung to their feet and hustled Jesus out of the town. They took him up to the brow of the hill their town was built on, intending to throw him down the cliff. So the people of Nazareth want to hurl Jesus over a cliff because he reminds them not only of God's graciousness, but God's graciousness to a person who was not Jewish. Naaman was a Syrian, an outsider. The people of Nazareth were offended that God's graciousness, God's hospitality, would be extended to people who were not Jewish. The Jesus that we meet in Luke's Gospel constantly challenges existing boundaries. Jesus is the embodiment of God's hospitality. He welcomes the outsider. With that in mind, let's come to today's Gospel story, the healing of 10 lepers, another story unique to Luke's Gospel. Like Naaman, these 10 men had Zaharat, not what today we'd know as Hansen's disease. The book of Leviticus makes it clear that when a priest diagnosed such a condition, the person was rendered ritually unclean. That meant that the person had to move to a safe distance from the town until he or she was cured. They had to cry out, "Unclean, unclean," whenever anyone approached. Such a condition was devastating because it exiled the person from home, family, and friends. It was as if they were dead. Jesus enters an unnamed village in the border region between Galilee and Samaria. Although Jesus encounters the lepers as he enters the village, Luke tells us that they stood at a distance. He does not touch any of them as he did the leprous man that he healed earlier in chapter 5. When they appeal to Jesus to take pity on them, he tells them to go and show themselves to the priests. The local priest would examine them and decide whether or not they were healed, whether or not they could return to their homes. As we heard in the Gospel, they all set out, and as they were going away, they were cleansed. Like all of Jesus' healings, this miracle is a sign that the kingdom of God has broken in upon the realm of sin and disease. You may recall that in last Sunday's Gospel, the disciples asked Jesus to increase their faith. Jesus tells them that if their faith were the size of a mustard seed, they could say to a mulberry tree, "Be uprooted and planted in the sea," and it would obey them. Here, today, we see such a faith in action. In turning to Jesus and asking for his mercy, the 10 lepers make their first steps towards true faith. They look to Jesus as their hope for salvation. They cry out, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." We, of course, make this same prayer at Mass, Kyrie eleison, Lord, have mercy. The Greek verb used here is eleeo. It expresses an outward movement of compassion that alleviates misery. This verb, used 32 times in the New Testament, unveils God's heart towards the helpless. It demonstrates not merely sentiment, but saving power. Note also that the lepers address Jesus as Master, a title not found on the lips of anyone else in Luke's Gospel except the disciples. So Jesus doesn't touch any of the lepers, nor does he pray over them. He simply challenges them to have faith in the power of his word. He tells them to go and show themselves to a priest. Now, they can obviously see that their condition hasn't changed, but they place their trust in the power of his word to heal them, and they step out in faith. Although not yet healed, they set out on their way to find a priest who can declare that they have been healed. And we're told that they were healed as they went on their way. But one of the lepers, finding himself cured, turned back, praising God at the top of his voice, and threw himself prostrate at the feet of Jesus and thanked him. Note that 10 were healed, but only one recognized the healing for what it was. And here we come to an unexpected twist in the gospel story. The leper who returned to give thanks was a Samaritan. Just as in a melodrama, the audience is encouraged to boo and hiss at the villain when he appears on stage, the very mention of a Samaritan at the time of Jesus would have elicited a similar response. Samaritans were despised by Jews. But who were the Samaritans? Following the death of King Solomon, the kingdom of David divided into 2 separate kingdoms. The northern kingdom was called Israel, and its capital was Samaria. The southern kingdom was Judah, and its capital was Jerusalem. The superpower of the day was Assyria, located in what today is Iraq. In 722 BC, the Assyrians annihilated the northern kingdom of Israel. Why wasn't the southern kingdom of Judah also annihilated? Simply because they quite wisely paid tribute to Assyria, unlike the northern kingdom that foolishly thought they could resist the might of Assyria. The story is told in the 2nd book of Kings and in the first part of the prophecy of Isaiah. The Assyrians were a powerful and ruthless people, and to prevent conquered peoples from rebelling, they scattered the populations of conquered peoples throughout their empire. The Assyrian emperor Sargon II claimed that he had taken 27,290 people from the kingdom of Israel into exile. That figure may well be inflated because we know that the majority of Israelites remained in the land. The Assyrians then repopulated conquered lands, in this case Israel, with conquered peoples from other parts of their empire. The Samaritans were primarily descendants of people whom the Assyrians had resettled in Israel. The capital of Israel was Samaria, so those who were resettled in Israel, some of whom intermarried with the Israelites, were known as Samaritans. Many of them embraced the Jewish religion, but the southerners, the Judeans, never accepted them as being truly Jewish. They despised them, and this had gone on for hundreds of years. The relationship between Jews and Samaritans was severely exacerbated in the 2nd century BC when the Hasmonean John Hyrcanus destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim in 129 BC. Here you can see the ruins of the Samaritan temple at Mount Gerizim. It's interesting that the two gospel stories that present a Samaritan favourably are found in Luke's Gospel, the parable of the Good Samaritan and today's story. It's also interesting to note that a Samaritan was numbered among the 10 lepers. The other 9 were presumably Jewish. In the common tragedy of their affliction, they had forgotten that they were Jews and Samaritans and remembered only that they were people in need of mercy. Let's spend a moment looking at some interesting parallels between these two stories of healing. Firstly, Elisha's response to the request to heal Naaman was a command. Go, wash in the Jordan 7 times. Similarly, Jesus tells the lepers, go and show yourselves to the priests. Both healing stories demanded an act of faith. Secondly, neither Naaman nor the Samaritan were Jews. They were foreigners. Thirdly, both Naaman and the Samaritan glorified God for their healing. It is significant that initially the Samaritan does not return to thank Jesus, but he glorifies God. Naaman returned to the man of God and said, now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. And he promised never again to offer up burnt offering or sacrifice to any god except the Lord. In other words, he offered God praise and worship. The Samaritan also gives thanks and praise for his healing. All 10 lepers received physical healing, but only one is saved. Jesus asks, were not 10 made clean? The other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to come back to give praise to God except this foreigner? The Greek verb translated here as found is heurisko. Here we find an echo of the 3 parables of God's mercy found earlier in chapter 15. The lost sheep, which is found. The lost coin, which is found. And the prodigal son, who is lost and then found, dead and now alive. The verb heurisko is found in all 3 parables. Notice that Jesus refers to the Samaritan as a foreigner. The Greek word is alogones. This same Greek word appears on an inscription that would once have been part of the soreg, the wall that separated the courtyard of the Gentiles from the inner courtyard of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, a wall beyond which no Gentile could proceed under pain of death. This is what the Jewish temple looked like at the time of Jesus, and you can see clearly the courtyard of the Gentiles and the Soreg. The inscription, which you can see here, was found by archaeologists in 1871 near St. Stephen's Gate in the northeastern corner of the Temple Mount. It reads, "No foreigner is to go beyond the balustrade and plaza of the temple zone. Whoever is caught doing so will have himself to blame for his death, which will follow." The word for foreigner is allogenes. It was the foreigner in today's gospel who alone expressed gratitude. St. Francis of Assisi is one of the best-loved saints of the Christian Church. The story of his conversion includes an extraordinary change in his attitude towards lepers, the most miserable and wretched outcasts of medieval society. And by this time we are talking about Hansen's disease, leprosy. That change of attitude reflected one of the greatest victories of grace in his entire life. Francis was an exceedingly fastidious young man who keenly abhorred lepers. Shortly before his death in October 1226, Francis wrote in his testament, "The Lord granted me, Brother Francis, to begin to do penance in this way. While I was in sin, it seemed very bitter to me to see lepers, and the Lord himself led me among them, and I had mercy upon them. And when I left them, that which seemed bitter to me was changed into sweetness of soul and body." Despite a natural loathing for lepers, Francis visited leper houses around Assisi, washing lepers' ulcerated flesh and serving them in whatever way he could. A delightful story about Francis and a leper tells how he overcame his natural repugnance. One day, when he was riding near Assisi, he came across a leper lying on the road. Francis dismounted, took the leper into his arms and kissed him. He then rode off, but as he turned to wish the leper farewell, the leper was nowhere to be seen. The moral of the story is clear. The leper was Christ. And Francis learnt at first hand that what is done to the least, the outcast, the most despised, is done also to Christ. This sculpture is in the grounds of St. Paul outside the walls in Rome. The hands of the prisoner are the hands of Christ himself. It's inspired by chapter 25 of St. Matthew's Gospel. "I was in prison and you visited me." It is a reminder that whatsoever you do to the least of my brothers and sisters, that you do unto me. When we learn to embrace the leper, whomever the leper might be in our own lives, that which seems bitter will be changed into sweetness of soul and body. Cardinal John O'Connor was Archbishop of New York from 1984 until his death in 2000. At the height of the AIDS epidemic, he went to St. Vincent's Hospital in Manhattan and emptied the bedpans of AIDS patients. He was not interested in how these men had contracted the disease. All he knew was that right now they were isolated and needed care and companionship. Pope Francis once likened the church to a field hospital and not to a gathering of those who are perfect. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugars. You have to heal his wounds. Then we can talk about everything else. The Jesus whom we encounter in the Gospel of Luke constantly challenges existing boundaries. As disciples of Jesus, we must never exclude today's lepers and Samaritans. In the Christian community, there must never be people who are considered beyond the pale. We are a field hospital for the casualties of life.